Greetings, fellow journeyers into the annals of time, and welcome back to Vibing History. Tonight, we delve into a pivotal moment that reshaped the very map of medieval Europe, the integration of Normandy into the burgeoning Kingdom of France. For centuries, this powerful duchy, born of Viking strength, stood as a contested prize, a land whose destiny was intertwined with both French kings and English monarchs. We will explore the intricate dance of power, the dramatic betrayals, and the calculated conquests that ultimately brought Normandy under the direct dominion of the French crown. Settle in, let the whispers of history guide your focus, and prepare for a deep immersion into a world where feudal allegiances clashed with royal ambitions. If you find value in these quiet explorations of the past, consider liking, sharing, or leaving a comment to help our community grow. Deep, calm, professional voice with ambient sounds of a crackling fireplace and a distant, gentle river flow. Good evening, history buffs, and welcome back to Vibing History. Tonight, we're embarking on a journey that will unravel one of the most fascinating and often brutal sagas in medieval Europe, the integration of Normandy into the royal domain of the Kingdom of France. It's a tale of shifting loyalties, epic betrayals, relentless warfare, and the slow, grinding process of assimilation that forever reshaped the map of power. Grab your favorite beverage, settle in, and let's dive deep into the very origins of this struggle, exploring how a Viking stronghold blossomed into a formidable duchy, and how its extraordinary rise inevitably put it on a collision course with the nascent French crown. Our story begins in 911 AD, a time when the echoes of Viking longboats were still very much present across the Frankish lands. King Charles the Simple, ruler of West Francia, a kingdom still wrestling with its identity, made a strategic, some might say desperate move. He ceded a significant portion of Neustria to a formidable Viking chieftain named Rollo through the Treaty of St. Clair-sur-Epte. This wasn't just a land grant. It was a gamble, a calculated risk to turn a marauding force into a defensive shield. And from this foundational act, the Duchy of Normandy was born. In its earliest days, Normandy, under Rollo and his successors, might have operated with an almost total independence. These were Viking chieftains, after all, and the intricate dance of the feudal system, with its oaths and allegiances, was likely foreign to their sensibilities. But the wheels of medieval governance, however slowly, began to turn. Soon enough, Normandy transitioned into a proper fiefdom. Its chieftain, now recognized as the Duke of Normandy, owed homage, a symbolic act of submission and loyalty to the King of France. But let's be clear, this homage was, for a very long time, little more than a polite nod. The Dukes of Normandy, with their nascent administrative prowess and formidable military might, quickly learned to navigate the feudal landscape to their immense advantage. They behaved like the heads of a quasi-sovereign state, a powerful entity within the larger, often fragmented Kingdom of France. Consider this: before 1140, a Duke of Normandy rarely, if ever, bothered to journey to the French court to pay his respects. The military service they owed to their suzerain, known as Hust, was kept minimal, a mere few dozen men for 40 days. Despite their capacity to raise armies of thousands, they were rarely present at the king's court, even though theoretically obliged. Yet, and this is crucial, the link, however tenuous, did exist. The Duchy of Normandy, for all its independence of spirit, was undeniably part of the Kingdom of France. Within their own territorial domain, the Dukes of Normandy wielded immense power, often surpassing that of many contemporary kings. They claimed rights previously held by the Carolingian monarchs, control over the church, the administration of justice, and the collection of taxes. They alone had the authority to construct fortresses and castles, mint coins, and levy direct taxes, an astonishingly rare privilege at a time when most rulers struggled to extract such levies. What truly set them apart, however, was their genius for administration. The Norman dukes established an efficient bureaucratic system and a feudal organization that, far from fragmenting their power, actually reinforced it. This was in stark contrast to many other principalities within the French kingdom, where feudalism often led to a weakening of central authority. On the ground, their authority was represented by viscounts who diligently controlled the judicial system, often to the detriment of local lords. This sophisticated and centralized system made the Duke of Normandy one of the most powerful lords of the early second millennium, sometimes, as we'll see, even eclipsing the authority of his own liege lord, the King of France. The entire Anglo-French chess game, the struggle for Normandy, truly escalates in 1066. This is the year William the Conqueror, then Duke of Normandy, took a daring leap across the Channel and seized the crown of England. Suddenly, the Duke of Normandy held two titles: Duke of Normandy, still a vassal to the King of France, and King of England, a sovereign in his own right. This seismic shift created an almost impossible geopolitical situation. The Anglo-Norman Empire, as it came to be known, now presented an immediate and existential threat to the stability and very existence of the French crown. The kings of France, with growing alarm, began to realize that they had to break up this formidable Anglo-Norman power bloc. Philip I, who was only 14 and under guardianship when William crossed to England, initially found himself powerless to prevent the conquest. His guardian, Baldwin V of Flanders, was, ironically, the father-in-law of the Duke of Normandy, creating a complex web of familial and political ties. But once Philip came of age, the danger became undeniably clear. His initial strategy was to contain Norman expansion. He prevented Normandy from extending its reach into the Duchy of Brittany with a campaign in 1076, forcing William the Conqueror to lift the siege of Dol. The following year, Philip I managed to capture the French Vexin, a crucial border territory, at the expense of Simon de Crépy. This region, the French Vexin, would become a perennial flashpoint, a source of almost continuous conflict between the Dukes of Normandy and the Kings of France. In 1087, William the Conqueror himself laid claim to it, and a decade later, his son, William the Red, invaded it. Philip I also pursued a policy designed to separate Normandy from England by supporting Robert Curthose, William the Conqueror's eldest son, in his struggle against his own father for the title of Duke of Normandy. This policy bore fruit, at least temporarily, in 1087, when the Anglo-Norman Empire was split between William the Conqueror's two sons. Robert Curthose inherited Normandy, and William the Red received the crown of England. Philip continued to back Robert Curthose, defending Normandy against William the Red's incursions in 1089. However, the latter part of Philip's reign saw a less far-sighted approach. He failed to oppose Robert's decision to entrust his duchy to his brother, the King of England, while Robert departed for the First Crusade. Nor did he object when, in 1106, Henry I of England, William the Conqueror's third son, who had succeeded his brother on the English throne, clashed with Robert Curthose over Normandy. This decisive confrontation, culminating in the Battle of Tinchebray, led to the reconstitution of the Anglo-Norman Empire, a strategic setback for France. Enter Louis VI, known as the Fighter, who ascended to the French throne in 1108. He quickly found himself entangled in conflict with Henry I of England, now also Duke of Normandy. Henry I sought to add the strategically important town of Gisors to his possessions, sparking a new war. While briefly interrupted by unrest within the royal domain, hostilities resumed in 1116. Louis VI unsuccessfully supported William Clito, son of Robert Curthose, in his bid for the Duchy of Normandy against his uncle Henry I. 2 years later, Louis VI made headway in the French Vexin, seizing control as far as the Andelle River, while his ally, Fulk the Younger, Count of Anjou, achieved victories near Alençon. But these successes were fleeting. Louis VI lost his allies and suffered a decisive defeat at the Battle of Bremuel in 1119. Pope Calixtus Roman II was called upon to mediate, and peace was ultimately restored on the basis of the status quo. However, Louis VI did manage to secure one significant concession. He obtained homage from William Adelin, Henry I's son, for Normandy. Henry I himself was unwilling to bow to another king, but allowed his heir to perform the symbolic act. Then tragedy struck. The very next year, William Adelin perished in the devastating shipwreck of the White Ship. This opened the door for William Clito, with Louis VI's support, to form a grand coalition against his uncle, Henry I, in 1122. War erupted once more in the French Vexin. But Henry I, a shrewd and capable ruler, played a masterful diplomatic card. He convinced his son-in-law, Emperor Henry V of the Holy Roman Empire, to attack the French king, forcing Louis VI to concentrate the bulk of his forces on defending Reims. By successfully repelling the emperor's forces, Louis VI earned a grudging respect from Henry I. This led to a peace in 1124 between the Kingdom of France and the Anglo-Norman Empire, a peace that, remarkably, endured for 3 decades. Louis VI, despite opportunities like the death of Henry I in 1135, which triggered a war of succession, chose not to exploit these divisions. Similarly, in 1137, he granted Normandy to Stephen of Blois through his son Eustace, even though Stephen already controlled England. This decision, to the detriment of Geoffrey Plantagenet, would have long-lasting consequences. Louis Roman VII, crowned King of France in 1137, initially followed his father's cautious policy, recognizing the Duchy of Normandy from Eustace Roman IV, Count of Boulogne. However, a significant shift occurred when Geoffrey Plantagenet conquered Normandy in 1144. At this point, the French king switched sides, aligning himself against the King of England and investing Geoffrey with the duchy. But the true turning point arrived in 1152, when Louis Roman VII had his marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine annulled. A mere 2 months later, Eleanor married the future King of England, Henry Roman II. This union dramatically expanded Henry Roman II's power, making him Duke of Aquitaine, in addition to his titles of Duke of Normandy and Count of Anjou, Maine, and Touraine. The sheer scale of this new Angevin empire immediately triggered Louis Roman VII's alarm. He promptly attacked Normandy, desperate to loosen the stranglehold that Plantagenet power was beginning to exert over the region. Yet, Henry Roman II, a formidable military leader, easily repelled the French king's forces. After Henry Roman II was formally recognized as King of England in 1154, Louis Roman VII supported Henry's brother, Geoffrey, in an attempt to sow discord, and managed to secure Henry's homage for his continental lands. In 1159, Louis Roman VII agreed to a marriage alliance between his daughter Margaret and Henry Roman II's son, Henry the Younger. This arrangement was intended to transfer the Norman Vexin to the young Henry's control, but in a brazen act, Henry Roman II immediately seized it himself, violating the treaty with the French king. By 1169, after a period of intense diplomatic maneuvering and skirmishes, Louis Roman VII received homage from Henry the Younger and the future Richard the Lionheart for their continental lands, including Normandy. However, he was forced to acknowledge the King of England's conquest of the Duchy of Brittany, another strategic loss. The stage was now set for the next, and arguably most pivotal, act in this unfolding drama, the reign of Philip Roman II, better known as Philip Augustus, who ascended to the throne in 1180 at the tender age of 15. Initially, relations with his powerful English vassal were surprisingly cordial. Henry Roman II did not intervene when Philip's mother sought his protection after her son seized part of her domain following his marriage to Isabelle de Hainaut. In fact, Henry Roman II even sent his sons to assist Philip when the young French king faced a feudal coalition arrayed against him. But this fragile cordiality was never destined to last. Relations quickly soured as Philip Augustus, with the cunning of a seasoned diplomat, skillfully exploited the incessant succession quarrels within the Angevin Empire. He actively supported Geoffrey, Duke of Brittany, against his brother Richard the Lionheart, who was the presumptive heir to the vast Angevin holdings. Geoffrey's sudden and brutal death in 1186 temporarily derailed Philip's plans, but after conquering Châteauroux, he managed to persuade Richard to align with him. A 2-year truce was concluded between the two princes, a development that caused immense worry for the aging Henry Roman II. War erupted again in 1188. Philip Augustus reconquered part of the Vexin region of Normandy, though he suffered losses on other borders. He again forged a peace with Richard, this time behind Henry Roman II back. In a momentous meeting between the three, Richard paid homage to the King of France for all the Angevin lands within the French kingdom. The following year, Philip Augustus and Richard united their forces, attacking Maine and Anjou. Henry Roman II, a king who had once dominated vast swaths of France, was forced to flee from Le Mans to Tours and then Chinon, where he died, abandoned and betrayed even by his second son, John, who had gone over to the enemy. Henry Roman II's death, however, did not immediately benefit Philip Augustus as much as he might have hoped. While he had succeeded in theoretically splitting the Angevin inheritance, with England going to Henry and the continental lands, including Normandy, to Richard, he now faced Richard as the sole formidable heir. Richard, a warrior king known as the Lionheart, was first crowned Duke of Normandy and then King of England. Almost all of Philip's conquests from 1189 were swiftly reclaimed by Richard, leaving the French king with only a small portion of Berry. Despite their rivalry, the two kings were compelled to reach an agreement. Both had pledged to participate together in the Third Crusade to retake Jerusalem. Before setting off, they swore an oath of friendship and loyalty to each other. Yet, as soon as they reached the Holy Land, their simmering animosity erupted into open quarrels, forcing the signing of a peace treaty in Messina in March 1191. The primary cause of this renewed friction was Richard's decision to renounce his intention to marry Philip's sister Adela, and, crucially, his return of her dowry, geysers that perennial point of contention. At the conclusion of the arduous siege of Acre in July 1191, Philip decided to return to his kingdom, while Richard remained to continue the crusade. On his departure, Philip solemnly promised the King of England that he would not touch his possessions. This promise, as we shall see, was made to be broken. Richard the Lionheart, on his perilous return journey to Europe, was captured by Leopold V of Austria and subsequently handed over to the Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI. When news of Richard's captivity reached Philip Augustus, the French king immediately began preparing an attack to conquer Normandy. He even sent money to the emperor, hoping to convince him not to release Richard. Upon hearing of his brother's capture, John, Richard's younger brother, who saw himself as the natural successor, hastily landed in Normandy. However, the Norman barons, ever wary of shifting allegiances, refused to swear fealty to him. John, ever the opportunist, then traveled to Paris to pay homage to the King of France for his brother's continental lands. As part of this audacious rapprochement, plans were even drawn up for a joint conquest of England, though this ultimately came to nothing. So, the King of France and his new, albeit unreliable, ally John focused their attention on Richard's continental possessions. In April 1193, through a cunning act of treachery by the Castellan geysers, that long-disputed prize fell into the hands of the King of France, followed swiftly by the entirety of the Vexin. Rouen, the heart of Normandy, seemed within Philip's grasp, but his siege of the city failed. The French king was forced to withdraw, vowing to return stronger the following year. Meanwhile, John, in his desperation, effectively relinquished the Norman territory east of the Seine, with the exception of Rouen and its immediate suburbs, as well as a portion of the Jura Valley, including Évreux and Verneuil, to the King of France. Since John lacked the legal authority to cede parts of the duchy, Philip Augustus invaded these promised lands in February 1194, laying siege to Verneuil, which had not yet fallen. At the same time, Richard, finally freed by the emperor and well aware of the French king's machinations to keep him captive, landed back in Normandy. He magnanimously granted a pardon to his treacherous brother John. By the end of May 1194, Richard arrived at Verneuil, whose siege had been lifted by the French before his arrival. In a gesture of supposed goodwill, John, who had been invested as Castellan of Evreux by Philip Augustus, reportedly handed the town over to his brother. War resumed between France and England, primarily outside Normandy, though a few French raids did occur near Rouen. In the summer of 1195, a conference between the two kings was convened at La Vaudreuil under papal arbitration. Philip, distrusting the loyalty of the location, ordered the castle razed to the ground in the middle of a meeting with Richard. Richard, outraged, summoned his troops, forcing the French king to flee and destroy the bridge over the Seine as he passed. War continued in Normandy, leading to the destruction of Dieppe. Then, on January 15, 1196, the two kings signed a treaty that confirmed Philip's possession of several towns, such as Vernon, Pacy, and most significantly, Gisors. However, it also confirmed the loss of Evreux and La Vaudreuil, a major setback for the French king compared to his gains in 1194. In the same year, Richard seized the island of Andely, a strategic location on the Seine, where he began construction of his magnificent fortress, Château-Gaillard, intended to defend Normandy against future French incursions. The war between the two kings continued with varying degrees of success. At Courcelles on September 28, 1198, Philip Augustus was very nearly captured by Richard's troops. A truce, intended to last 5 years, was finally signed in November. But destiny, as it often does, had other plans. In March 1199, the curtain fell on Richard the Lionheart. He met his end during the siege of the Château de Chalais-Chabrol in the Limousin region, a tragic accident that utterly transformed the face of the Anglo-French conflict. Richard, having no direct legitimate descendants, left a gaping void, plunging the Angevin Empire into a bitter succession crisis. On one side stood his younger brother, John Lackland, who claimed the throne as the family's eldest male descendant. On the other, Arthur of Brittany, Richard's nephew, asserted his claim by virtue of the right of representation, which his father, Geoffrey, would have had over all the lands had he survived Richard. England and Normandy, following Norman custom which favored the uncle over the nephew, chose John as Richard's successor. He was crowned Duke of Normandy in Rouen on April 25, 1199, and a month later, King of England in London. Yet despite these coronations, the powerful barons of Touraine, Anjou, and Maine threw their support behind Arthur. Philip Augustus, ever the opportunist, seized this golden chance to champion Arthur's claims. Simultaneously, he took control of Evreux and Conches and advanced into Anjou, ostensibly to support the rights of Arthur, who had been entrusted by his mother to Philip Augustus's custody. This tumultuous succession allowed French royal troops to penetrate towns that were hostile to John. In August 1199, a peace conference was convened in Normandy between the two kings. Philip, in his role as suzerain, forcefully reminded John of his feudal obligations. He shrewdly exploited John's negligence, for John had done little to secure his suzerain's formal investiture in the disputed Richard's succession. Philip Augustus demanded Anjou and Maine for Arthur. Touraine, in the interim, had been recovered by Eleanor, John's formidable mother and Duchess of Aquitaine, and for himself the Norman Vexin. When John predictably refused these terms, negotiations broke down. However, a sudden twist. Shortly thereafter, William des Roches, the influential seneschal of Anjou, switched his allegiance to John Lackland and orchestrated a reconciliation between Arthur and John, effectively sidelining the King of France. Philip, seeing his leverage diminish, abandoned Arthur's cause. Arthur, meanwhile, fled from his uncle's grasp to seek refuge in Angers, and signed the Treaty of Le Goulet with John. This treaty officially recognized John as Richard's legitimate successor and, crucially, as Philip's vassal for his continental fiefs. Arthur, in turn, became John's vassal for Brittany. Philip's earlier conquests of the county of Evreux and the Norman Vexin were confirmed, solidifying his territorial gains. In a bid to further cement peace, Blanche of Castile, John's niece, was married to Philip's son, Louis. John also paid a substantial sum of 20,000 marks for the recognition of his fiefs, especially in Brittany. In the midst of all this high-stakes political maneuvering, Philip Augustus, for a moment, abandoned his immediate designs on Normandy. But the intricate dance of medieval power was far from over. The powerful Lusignan family, prominent in Poitou, now entered the fray. They were embroiled in a dispute with the house of Angoulême over the possession of the county of La Marche. John, in an attempt to secure peace, had awarded La Marche to Hugh Roman IX de Lusignan, sealing the agreement with the promise of marriage between Hugh's son and heir, also named Hugh, and Isabella of Angoulême, the only daughter of Count Aymer of Angoulême. However, in July 1200, during a trip to Aquitaine, John Lackland, ever impetuous, became utterly captivated by Isabella, and without ceremony kidnapped her. John, who had just separated from his own wife, hastily married Isabella at the end of August. This enraged the Lusignans, who saw their hopes for the lands of Angoulême shattered, as John now became the direct heir to the county of Angoulême. At Easter 1201, John further exacerbated tensions by thwarting a plot against him, seizing La Marche, and attempting to confiscate the lands of the Count of Eu, who was implicated in the conspiracy. The King of France, who had been patiently awaiting an opportunity to revive his old dream of conquering Normandy, decided to maintain peace for the time being. He was not yet fully prepared for a large-scale confrontation. The Lusignans, feeling deeply wronged, appealed to their lord, John Lackland. But John, who was also the perpetrator of their grievances, refused to bring the case before the feudal court of Poitiers. This blatant denial of justice provided the Lusignans with a crucial legal recourse. They appealed to John's suzerain for his continental lands, King Philip Augustus of France. Philip, sensing an unparalleled windfall, eagerly supported the Lusignans' cause and compelled John to appear in Paris, a fortnight after Easter, to answer for the denial of justice. On April 28, 1202, John Lackland failed to appear before the French royal court, directly disobeying the orders of his suzerain. This act of blatant defiance under feudal law was grounds for severe penalty. In a rarely applied but legally sound procedure, the royal court confiscated from John all the continental lands he held, including the coveted Duchy of Normandy. The legal framework was established. Now, it was time for military force to make it a reality. To enforce this momentous sentence, the King of France resumed the war in June 1202. Philip Augustus first invaded Normandy from the northeast, swiftly gaining control of Eu, Drincourt, Mortemer, and Lyons. He then laid siege to Gurney, capturing it thanks to a cunning stratagem. Philip Augustus broke a dam on the Epte River, sending a torrent of water that swept away the town's defenses. By the end of July, while simultaneously laying siege to Arques, Philip Augustus made a crucial alliance. He promised Arthur of Brittany, in exchange for his loyalty, the hand of his daughter Mary and his investiture as count in the counties of Brittany, Poitou, Anjou, Maine, and Touraine. He also formally armed him as a knight. On Philip's orders, Arthur immediately set off to open a second front in Poitou, aiming to conquer his future lands. Despite the assistance of rebellious Poitevin lords, including the aggrieved Lusignans, Arthur ultimately failed. He was taken prisoner by John during the siege of Mirebeau, a devastating blow to the French strategy. Arthur and the other captives were then incarcerated in the formidable fortress of Falaise. Upon hearing of the capture of his allies, the King of France temporarily raised the siege of Arques. However, by late 1202, Philip received a significant boost. The powerful seneschal of Poitou, William des Roches, now deeply hostile to John's treatment of Arthur, defected to the French side. William brought with him not only his own vassals, including the Viscount of Thouars and the majority of the lords of Poitou, but also the lords of Anjou and Touraine, who thus pledged their support to their new suzerain, the King of France. These crucial submissions effectively carved John's remaining continental lands into two separate geographical units, isolating Aquitaine. Inspired by this shift, many Breton and Norman lords, disgruntled with John's erratic rule, also joined the growing French cause. In January 1203, Robert I, the Count of Alençon, defected from John and paid homage to Philip for his lands, effectively opening up Upper Normandy to the French advance. By April 1203, military operations in Normandy intensified. French soldiers and Norman lords in revolt against John quickly began to cordon off the duchy, with John increasingly entrenched in Pont de l'Arche, virtually under siege in his own territory. In early May, two more important Norman lords, Hugues de Gurney and Pierre de Moulin, switched allegiance to the French king, surrendering their fortresses to Philip's forces, who now controlled the vital Ryle Valley. The French king then systematically seized Beaumont-le-Roger, Conches, and other smaller towns. La Vaudreuil, a seemingly well-prepared town for a long siege, surprisingly surrendered without a fight in June. By August, Philip took Raidpont, and then the formidable Château-Gaillard itself. These fortresses, intended to protect Rouen, were now caught in a pincer movement. John, for his part, attempted to create a diversion by attacking Brittany, after several unsuccessful assaults on Alençon. In a swift 5-day campaign, he ravaged Dol and Fougères before abruptly returning to Normandy. Increasingly isolated, and the subject of French propaganda hinting that he had murdered Arthur, Arthur did indeed die in April 1203, possibly at John's hands. Though the full truth remained shrouded in mystery for years, John set sail from Barfleur for England in December 1203, ostensibly to raise an army, but many saw it as an abandonment. In mid-February 1204, the King of France arrived at the fortress of Château-Gaillard, which his troops had been besieging for several arduous months. This magnificent fortress, built by Richard the Lionheart only 8 years prior to be an impregnable bulwark against French incursions, had become a symbol of Norman resistance. Philip Augustus, recognizing its strategic importance and symbolic weight, was determined to bring it down as quickly as possible. After a long and incredibly complicated siege, made more difficult by the fortress's ingenious double enclosure, Château-Gaillard finally fell on March 6, 1204. Its capture sent shockwaves through John's remaining supporters in Normandy, effectively opening the road to Rouen to the French. The final campaign for the conquest of Normandy began in earnest on May 2, 1204. In a matter of days, Philip Augustus's forces swept through the region, securing Pont de l'Arche, Roche-sur-Ivel, Le Neubourg, Moulineaux, and Montfort-sur-Aille. Having strategically bypassed Rouen, Arques, and Verneuil for the moment, the King of France was presented with the surrender of Argentan on May 7 by its Flemish defender, Roger de Gouy. Falaise then fell after a remarkably swift 7-day siege, and Caen, another major city, capitulated with virtually no resistance. William Crassus, the Seneschal of Normandy, retreated to Rouen, where Philip Augustus pursued him, laying siege to the city towards the end of May. Simultaneously, Breton forces, intent on avenging Arthur's death, attacked the Avranchin region to the west. Exploiting a favorable tide, they first conquered Mont Saint-Michel by fire, a chilling testament to the brutality of the conflict. They then joined forces with the French armies at Caen before conquering the remainder of Avranchin and then Cotentin. Rouen, the capital of Normandy, now found itself under siege. The city was prepared for a long and arduous defense. Provisions from across Normandy were plentiful, intended to sustain the inhabitants for an extended period, and the last holdouts against the French occupation had sought refuge behind the city's formidable high walls and triple moats. The defense was commanded by Peter de Préaux, assisted by the elite of the local barons. However, on June 1, 1204, the city signed a remarkable agreement with the French. It stipulated surrender in the event of failure or absence of rescue attempts within the following 30 days. This treaty also encompassed the towns of Arques and Verneuil, which had been invested but not yet taken by the royal troops. The fear among the Rouennais that their vital commercial advantages would be irrevocably lost if they resisted for too long ultimately proved stronger than their resolve. They preferred to surrender without a fight. On June 24, even before the 30-day deadline had expired, the city gates were opened, and French troops marched into Rouen without any resistance from the population. Only Dieppe, whose commercial life was too heavily dependent on maritime relations with England, resisted the authority of the French king until 1207. France's conquest of mainland Normandy was now complete. However, the Channel Islands, historically belonging to the Duchy of Normandy, remained unconquered. The French king lacked the necessary ships, and his troops were too unfamiliar with naval warfare to attempt anything against them. The kings of France would subsequently claim all these islands, but they remained firmly under the control of the English crown, a small but enduring symbol of the Anglo-Norman legacy. With the conquest complete, Normandy was now formally integrated into the royal domain. But the lingering question remained: were the wars against the English truly over, or would the English, sooner or later, seek to reclaim these lands through arms or diplomacy. Feudal customs, in a sense, favored the King of England, as land confiscated by a suzerain from his vassal could be returned if the latter repented. However, Philip Augustus had absolutely no intention of relinquishing Normandy. John Lackland, despite his earlier failures, made several attempts to reclaim his confiscated continental lands. In 1206, he laid siege to Thouars in Poitou, and in 1213–1214, he played a central role in a vast and formidable coalition formed against the King of France. This alliance included Emperor Otto Roman IV, Renaud de Dampmartin, Ferdinand of Flanders, Theobald I de Lorraine, Henry I of Brabant, William I de Holland, and Philippe Roman II de Courtenay-Namur. Despite the sheer number and power of its members, this formidable alliance suffered several decisive defeats that ultimately shattered it. First John at La Rochelle on July 2, 1214, by Crown Prince Louis, and then most famously, on July 27, 1214, at the pivotal Battle of Bouvines, a victory that would reshape French history. After this crushing defeat, John faced a direct invasion from Prince Louis, son and heir of Philip Augustus, who landed in England in May 1216 with the intention of seizing the English crown, offered to him by English barons in revolt against King John. John's opportune death, however, thwarted Louis's plans, as the English barons quickly rallied around the new heir, Henry Roman III. Upon the death of King Philip Augustus on July 14, 1223, the English king, Henry Roman III, attempted to intimidate the new King of France, Louis Roman VIII, by protesting against Philip's conquests and calling upon the nobles and burghers of Normandy to revolt and return to English obedience. The new King of France, however, firmly asserted his inherited rights, stating that he could prove his claim if Henry Roman III would present himself at the French court. From 1224 onwards, several naval battles occurred before Henry Roman III, taking advantage of Louis Roman VIII's untimely death, enticed the Count of Brittany, Peter Mauclerc, into an act of treason. Henry then landed at St. Malo himself for a campaign that, despite his ambitious plans to reconquer all lost lands, ultimately failed. He signed a peace agreement that lasted until 1242, when he landed at Royan, only to be defeated once more at Saints. This marked Henry Roman III's last military attempt to reconquer the mainland. From this point forward, diplomacy would play a key role, and while Louis Roman IX, known as Saint Louis, was open to dialogue, he never recovered the lands. In 1258, the King of France and the King of England signed the landmark Treaty of Paris. This agreement granted Henry Roman III certain fiefs in the dioceses of Limoges, Cahors, and Périgueux, and formally recognized his claim to Guyenne. In exchange, Henry Roman III officially renounced his lost lands, including Normandy, with the exception of the Channel Islands, and declared himself a vassal of the King of France for his continental territories. This treaty definitively confirmed the French conquest of Normandy, bringing an end to the direct Anglo-Norman conflict over the duchy. But the conquest was only the first step. The true challenge lay in the deep and complex process of assimilation, integrating a fiercely independent duchy, with its own customs, laws, and loyalties, into the fabric of the French royal domain. The Norman nobility, naturally, found themselves in the most precarious position following this annexation. They were forced to make an agonizing choice between two overlapping vassalage obligations: to the Duke, who was also the King of England, and to the Duke's suzerain, the King of France. This choice was further complicated by the fact that many nobles owned lands on both sides of the Channel, having moved between their continental and island estates for over a century. In 1204, the Norman nobility comprised some 2,000 knights, including about 60 barons, 10 of whom held the prestigious title of Count, though only 4 had their earldoms solely in Normandy, the rest being in England or elsewhere in the kingdom. Normandy's feudal system was somewhat unusual for its relative lack of hierarchy. Few of the Duke's vassals had vassals of their own, meaning the Duke maintained direct and potent control over the feudal structure. Philip Augustus wasted no time. He issued a clear ultimatum. Nobles who wished to retain their Norman lands had to renounce their English holdings and swear homage to him, severing all feudal ties with John Lackland. The deadline was initially set for 1 year from April 1205, later extended to Christmas 1205. After this date, nobles who had not made their choice would forfeit their Norman lands. Feudal law did permit paying homage to 2 different kings for different lands, making the choice even more complex and agonizing for many Norman nobles. There were, however, a few notable exceptions. William the Marshal, the renowned Earl of Pembroke, owned several important fiefs in Normandy. In May 1204, he shrewdly concluded an agreement with Philip, temporarily handing over his Norman lands to the King of France. In return, he secured a 12-month delay and a substantial sum of money. The agreement stipulated that if Normandy was indeed conquered by the French after this period, he would then pay homage to the King of France. And so, in 1205, he obtained John's authorization to go and pay homage to Philip, thereby managing to retain his lands on both sides of the Channel, a rare and impressive feat. Other exceptions included Robert de Fontenay, who owned the Norman fief of Fontenay-le-Marmion, in addition to his English fiefdoms; Eleanor de Vitré, destined to become Countess of Salisbury, who kept her Norman domain until her death in 1233, and Alix, Countess of Eu. John, furious at the loss of Normandy, compounded his mistakes by rushing to demand the presence of his vassals, threatening forfeiture of their English lands if they refused. As early as 1204, he compiled a list of nobles who had remained in Normandy and had their property seized. Some, like Robert Roman IV Bertrand, suffered the devastating loss of both their English and Norman fiefs. For many Anglo-Norman lords, the choice of which fief to keep was made without any sentimental attachment to either king. They simply retained the most important or valuable one, even if it meant abandoning a ruler they might have felt closer to. While it's difficult to compile an exhaustive list of all nobles who lost their Norman fiefs, estimates suggest that about 50% of the great barons opted for England, while a smaller but still significant 5–10% of the rest of the nobility, roughly 200 nobles, also chose England. These choices were incredibly difficult for most, as England often represented a large part of their income. Some attempted clever maneuvers, like Alain Mardel, who managed to exchange his English lands for the Norman lands of Elias de Wimbleville. Others divided their lands, bequeathing the Norman holdings to one son and the English holdings to another, effectively splitting families into two branches. However, despite these exceptions, most such subtleties were forbidden, particularly by the King of France. Until the reign of Saint Louis, a strict rule was enforced. Norman lands were confiscated upon the death of a lord if his closest heir resided in England. This decision created inextricable legal quagmires around disputed inheritances. For instance, in 1215, when Thomas de Lyon and William Cornet were brought before the Exchequer of Normandy over a land dispute, the Exchequer initially concluded that the land should revert to Real-Huigen, who had moved to England, and thus the land was confiscated by the King of France. But 4 years later, William Cornet proved that Real-Huigen had actually died in England before 1191, and that he was his closest descendant, so the land was returned to him. Many descendants, in desperate attempts to reclaim their heritage, tried to prove, often falsely, that their ancestor had died before 1204. But this situation also created conditions for abuse, as in the case of the lands of Bernard de Montpenchin's aunt, who died in Normandy and was unable to pass on her land to him because her husband had died in England. The clergy, following the French conquest, represented a powerful political and moral force, absolutely essential for the successful integration of Normandy. Philip Augustus, understanding this deeply, began as early as 1200 to court the Norman clergy, an operation that proved remarkably successful after the conquest. Since the time of William the Conqueror, ducal power had asserted its right to influence the investiture of abbots and bishops. John Lackland, before the conquest, had notoriously abused this power, directly intervening in appointments and, even worse, deliberately prolonging vacancies of episcopal sees to maximize the duke's right of regal essentially, the right to collect the revenues of vacant ecclesiastical offices. In stark contrast to John, Philip Augustus, as soon as a Norman territory was conquered, implemented the same policy he maintained in the Kingdom of France, where Louis the Younger had voluntarily relinquished much of his authority over the Church to ensure its loyalty. In 1200, when the French annexed the Evresin region, they immediately announced new episcopal elections for the See of Evreux. An investigation revealed that the election of the incumbent, Garin de Siri, who was also close to John, had been manipulated by the intervention of the English kings, despite their having no legal right to do so. With Philip Augustus's benevolence, Evreux was permitted to freely elect its bishop. After the total conquest of Normandy in 1204, the Norman bishops were forced to choose sides, a decision made all the more complicated by the fact that, according to Norman custom, they owed faith and homage to the Duke of Normandy. When approached, Pope Innocent III, who generally supported the King of England but recognized Philip Augustus's military superiority, stated that he could not offer an opinion, as he was not fully informed of the situation. The bishops, interpreting this diplomatic noncommittal as a green light, took it as a rallying call to the King of France, and never again failed to respond to his summons. They quickly demonstrated their support by participating with Philip Augustus, 3 of them, in the Albigensian Crusade in 1209. Later, 5 out of 7 attended Philip Augustus's funeral in 1223, a clear sign of their new allegiance. Through this strategic shift, the Church of Normandy gained not only the right to freely elect its bishops, but also an end to the interminable vacancies between two episcopal elections. The monks of the abbeys were also soon granted the right to freely elect their abbots. In return for these significant concessions, Philip Augustus was able to exercise the traditional rights of the Dukes of Normandy, notably preventing the introduction of new tithes, removing the church's right of control over wills, and protecting lay fiefs from ecclesiastical jurisdiction. Furthermore, Philip Augustus introduced banishment as a punishment for clerics convicted of crimes, a crucial assertion of royal authority. Unlike the nobility, Norman clerics were not forced to choose between their possessions in Normandy and England. Since 1066, Normandy, home to some of the most prestigious abbeys in the West, had seen all its monasteries acquire extensive lands in England, and the Norman religious communities had become highly dependent on these revenues. None of them had any interest in severing these vital ties with England. Philip Augustus, keenly aware of this, had no intention of clashing with the powerful Norman clergy on such a sensitive issue. Despite this privilege, the religious communities initially faced difficulties in having their rights fully recognized. The abbot of Saint-Étienne-de-Quin was the first to conclude an agreement with England in 1205, followed shortly thereafter by the abbot of the Trinité de Fécamp. And with the exception of the Abbey of Mont Saint-Michel, which struggled to gain recognition for its lands across the Channel until 1212, each religious community was eventually able to recover its cross-channel holdings. However, exploiting these revenues was a complicated business, heavily dependent on the diplomatic climate between France and England. As soon as tensions arose, it became extremely difficult for clerics to travel between the two countries. From the 13th century onwards, and particularly during the 14th century, many religious communities began selling off their English possessions, which had become less valuable and more troublesome to manage since the Conquest. As for the cities, as soon as the French arrived in the Norman towns, the inhabitants largely submitted to the conqueror with surprising speed. It's true that, apart from a few wealthy citizens with strong ties to England, the majority of the population had little vested interest in preserving English rule. Philip Augustus, for his part, made several shrewd moves in favor of the towns as his forces advanced in 1204. In May of that year, the town of Falaise had its status as a commune confirmed, and its mayor, André Propense, was richly endowed with lands likely confiscated from others. In Keene and Rouen, the existing privileges of the bourgeois were confirmed. The commune of Verneuil was recognized, and its mayor, Etienne Le Petit, was granted land. In Bretuil, the commune's burghers were exempted from certain customs. Also in 1204, Philip Augustus went further, actively creating 3 new Norman communes at Les Andelys, Non-Ancourt, and Pont-Audemer. Until the end of his reign, Philip Augustus continued to grant numerous privileges to the Norman communes, carefully cultivating their loyalty. However, the communes of Normandy were unique in their origins, often born from the Duke's own desire and will, rather than from a popular revolt against a lord, which was the more common pattern in the rest of the kingdom. John Lackland himself had imposed commune status on many towns, primarily as a means to raise money. Consequently, many of the communal charters imposed by the dukes were not confirmed by Philip Augustus as early as 1204, including those for Offa, Alençon, Bayeux, Cherbourg, Domfront, Évreux, Fécamp, Harfleur, and Montevilliers. It's even likely that some of these had not fully formed their communal structures. Other communes, such as Falaise and two of Philip Augustus's own creations, Les Andelys and Nonancourt, were eventually to disappear. Yet, some towns, notably the capital Rouen, along with Eu, Pont-Audemer, and Dieppe, remained very active as communes, despite their communal status having been imposed by John Lackland shortly before the French conquest. These towns were governed by the establishments of Rouen, a system that allowed the king to choose the mayor from a list of 3 names put forward by the commune's bourgeois. In this way, the King of France maintained complete control over the local government of the towns. In 1256, Louis Roman IX extended this system to all communes in the kingdom, even the smallest, further centralizing royal authority. The upper middle classes who populated these communes readily accepted the new French power. The same families, indeed often the very same men, continued to hold positions of influence at the head of the communes. In Rouen, Jean Luce, who had played a significant role in the city before the French conquest, was appointed mayor 3 times between 1206 and 1218. A member of the Fessart family, from which some mayors had been recruited during the ducal period, was again appointed mayor in 1221. Throughout the first half of the 13th century, other families who had governed the city before 1204 once again became mayors of Rouen. However, one city stood out as profoundly missing the Angevin Empire: Dieppe. Its citizens were in constant commercial contact with England, and the town lost a great deal with the French conquest. One early incident between the French authorities and the Dieppois involved the arrest of a fisherman, which escalated into a series of clashes. This resulted in the French depriving the town of water until it paid the king a hefty fine of £400. Relations began to calm only when John Lackland reversed his earlier ban on all trade between French Normandy and England. Philip Augustus, in a strategic move, let things slide, even when Dieppois burghers provided John with ships that enabled him to disembark in Poitou in 1206. In the decades that followed, the commercial advantages granted to Normans in England were not immediately called into question. Even in 1229, when Henry Roman III suspended relations with most of Europe, certain Normans were among the few authorized to trade. Henry Roman III hoped to gain their support for a planned landing. Thus, in the spring of 1230, 9 of the ships that transported Henry Roman III to Brittany originated from Normandy, though it's also possible that the shipowners had been requisitioned against their will. The decade of the 1230 was marked by numerous incidents, as Henry Roman III now actively sought to harm French merchants by any means necessary. Under the growing influence of Louis Roman IX, English sailors began to view Norman sailors as rivals rather than allies, a sentiment increasingly reciprocated by the Normans. The Treaty of Paris in 1259 finally put an end to the privileges of Norman sailors, who from then on traded with English ports not as compatriots, but as foreigners. This shift culminated in the Franco-English War of 1293, during which Norman sailors sank 81 English ships. This rapid Francization of Norman commercial loyalties was largely due to the new and lucrative outlets for Normandy merchants in the thriving Paris region, actively encouraged by Philip Augustus from 1210 onwards. With these agreements and incentives, the inland towns of Normandy quickly and firmly rallied to France. In terms of administration, despite the conquest, the Duchy of Normandy continued to exist, both in legal texts and in reality. The King of France referred to Normandy as his Duchy of Normandy, although he never personally adopted the title of Duke of Normandy. There was no longer a specific enthronement ceremony for Normandy. The King of France automatically became Duke of Normandy upon his coronation in Reims. Another significant change was the abolition of the Seneschal of Normandy, an office that, since William the Conqueror, had been responsible for governing the country in the Duke's absence, whether he was in England or abroad. However, the unity of Normandy itself was gradually undermined by French sovereigns over the years. Philip Augustus initially granted Mortain and Domfront to the Count of Boulogne, but without making them truly independent counties from Normandy. Louis Roman IX later changed this policy, entrusting small counties to his sons, often without reference to the overarching structure of Normandy. Thus, the counties of Poitiers and Alençon were granted to his son Pierre in March 1269. Upon Pierre's death, they reverted to the crown, only to be granted again by Philip the Fair to Charles de Valois in 1291. The same fate befell the county of Évreux and the seigneury of Beaumont-le-Roger, given to the king's brother Louis in 1298, and the county of Mortain to Philippe d'Évreux in 1318. Under Philip Augustus, the idea was also born of creating a kind of buffer zone between Normandy and the Duchy of France. After the conquest, he consolidated several Norman and French provosteships to form a sort of Norman March or borderland. Crucially, Philip Augustus maintained Norman law after the conquest for several compelling reasons. Firstly, customary legal unity had not yet been achieved in France. There were dozens of different local customs, each covering a small, limited territory, and the King of France had no singular custom he could impose universally. Secondly, Norman custom was, in many respects, more advantageous to the sovereign than any other custom in France, whether in feudal or criminal matters. He did, however, modify a few specific points to bring the Normans closer to the legal standing of other French subjects, notably by removing the appellant's privileged position in dueling. Throughout the 13th century, Norman custom was further modified by royal ordinances that applied across the entire Kingdom of France, and therefore in Normandy, except in cases where Norman custom was explicitly deemed superior or more beneficial. In judicial matters, Philip Augustus maintained the Exchequer, a sovereign court that had long symbolized Normandy's unique independence. However, it underwent major changes. The presidency was now held by royal commissioners, and the king often appointed his closest advisors to these crucial roles. These advisors, often from Paris, were unfamiliar with the intricacies of Norman custom. As soon as a complicated case arose, they systematically referred it to the king, often leading to a total violation of Norman customary law, as several Norman cases were now brought before the Parliament of Paris. Royal agents were also sent by Philip Augustus to fill the posts of bailiffs, an administrative office that had already been instituted by the King of England from 1190 onwards. Within the Kingdom of France, bailiffs were high-ranking civil servants, appointed and paid by the king, whom they represented in matters of administration, justice, and military summons. They served as superiors to other royal agents in Normandy, such as viscounts and sergeants. Geographically, until 1230, the bailliages the districts administered by bailiffs, were often shifting, informal districts, referred to by the name of the bailiff rather than the region or town they administered. Subsequently, more fixed geographical bailliages emerged, representing a specific town or region. Until 1243, Normandy's bailiffs were all foreigners to the duchy, but most made efforts to integrate, acquiring property in Normandy and making donations to Norman churches for burial. Later, Norman bailiffs were appointed, though they remained a minority compared with foreign appointees. In contrast, viscounts, provosts, and sergeants, other important royal officials, were mostly Norman, suggesting a targeted assimilation at different levels of administration. Many of the Norman lands confiscated from nobles who had chosen England were retained as crown property and managed by royal administration. Other lands were granted to nobles from the royal domain, mostly to minor nobles, who thus became agents of French assimilation. The kings of France also actively encouraged marriages between Norman and Ile-de-France nobles, further blending the aristocracy. By the end of the 13th century, simmering discontent in Normandy erupted into open revolts, as royal power increasingly challenged existing privileges concerning justice and taxation. In judicial matters, the Normans had long been dissatisfied with the fact that the exchequer, their cherished court, was often presided over by foreigners unfamiliar with their laws. Furthermore, from the end of the 13th century, the punctuality of the exchequer's sessions dwindled, and in some years it did not meet at all, leading to significant delays in legal cases across Normandy. In 1302, Philip the Fair took steps to ensure that the exchequer met twice a year and ceased its itinerant nature, settling permanently in Rouen. Another major source of discontent was the practice of Normans being tried in Paris, both at first instance and on appeal, despite the supposed sovereignty of their own exchequer. In terms of taxation, Philip the Bold and Philip the Fair substantially increased the financial contributions demanded from Normandy, primarily to fund wars with Aragon and military operations in Flanders. While they invoked the prerogatives of the former dukes, they added a new justification for these levies: the defense of the kingdom. For the Normans, these new taxes were a blatant violation of their customary rights. In 1292, a riot erupted in Rouen, with an angry mob demolishing the receiver's house and besieging the King of France's servants in the castle. It took the mayor's intervention to calm the angry citizens, and prevent the demonstration from escalating into an outright anti-French uprising. Under Philip the Fair, the anger of the Normans grew year by year, as did the taxes, especially given that the king's powerful chamberlain, Enguerrand de Marigny, the absolute controller of the kingdom's finances, ironically hailed from the lower nobility of Normandy. Other Normans also held important financial positions with the King of France, adding to the local resentment. In the final months of Philip the Fair's reign, an unprecedented anti-tax crisis swept across the entire kingdom. It began in 1314, when a new tax was levied to finance an expedition to Flanders that concluded without a single battle. Public opinion simply could not comprehend how so much money had been collected for such a negligible result. Enguerrand de Marigny became the scapegoat, widely accused of treason, especially as the collection of taxes for Flanders continued even after peace had been declared. When Philip the Fair died in 1314, his successor, Louis X, known as the Quarrelsome, inherited a deeply complicated and volatile situation. In March 1315, a few months after his coronation, the King of France, in a crucial move to appease his restless subjects, granted provincial charters to various provinces of the Kingdom of France. The very first of these, and arguably the most significant, was for Normandy, adopted after intense negotiations with the Norman representatives. This Charte aux Normands was not only the first of the provincial charters, but also the only one not to fade into oblivion after a few years. It contained texts that satisfied all Normans, from the burghers of the towns to the nobles and even the poorest commoners. It significantly limited the king's rights in Normandy in a number of specific and vital areas, including fiscal, military, and judicial matters. Some of its articles 3, 4, 17, 21, and 22 effectively acted as a Norman constitution, making it a document without equivalent in France. Articles 3 and 4, concerning military matters, stipulated that vassals owed the king no more than the 40 days of service provided for by feudal custom. Towns had to provide only their contingent of sergeants and no more, and Normans owed no more than their traditional service. Furthermore, the king could no longer claim anything directly from his rear vassals, vassals of his vassals. Articles 17 and 21 addressed judicial matters, finally granting the exchequer the judicial autonomy the Normans had been demanding. The Parlement de Paris no longer acted as a court of appeal for Norman cases, and Normans could no longer be tried outside the province. Article 22, concerning taxation, guaranteed the Normans that the king would not be able to collect more than he normally collected, except in cases of great necessity, recognized by the representatives of the Norman estates. The Charte aux Normands remained in force until the French Revolution, a testament to its enduring power and significance. It was constantly confirmed by the various kings of France, although, as history often reminds us, the letter of the law can sometimes be bent, and its spirit over time respected less and less. And there you have it, friends. The long, intricate journey from Viking settlement to a firmly integrated French province. Normandy's rise, its pivotal role in the Anglo-French chess game, the fateful betrayals, and the slow, grinding process of assimilation. It's a story filled with both brutal conflict and the intricate negotiations that shaped the medieval world. Join us next time on Vibing History as we continue to explore the often turbulent, always fascinating narratives of the past. Until then, stay curious and keep vibing with history. All right, settle in everyone. Draw up a chair by the crackling fire, let the wind whisper its ancient tales outside, and let's dive back into the swirling currents of history. Last time we laid the groundwork, watching as Normandy, a Viking creation, grew into a formidable duchy, its dukes often more potent than the very French kings they theoretically served. We saw the audacious gamble of William the Conqueror, the shifting alliances, and the slow, simmering tension as the Anglo-Norman realm expanded into the vast, sprawling entity known as the Angevin Empire, a political beast that gnawed at the very stability of the French kingdom. Today, we journey into the heart of that conflict, to a period of betrayal, ambition, and the dramatic unraveling of centuries of history. We're talking about the turn of the 13th century, a pivotal moment when the balance of power shifted decisively, and the destiny of Normandy hung precariously in the balance. This is the story of John Lackland's downfall and the monumental conquest of Normandy by the French crown. Picture this. It's the year 1199. The charismatic, fiercely intelligent, and notoriously short-tempered Richard the Lionheart, King of England and Duke of Normandy, has just met his untimely end. He's been struck down by a crossbow bolt during a siege at the Château de Chalais-Chabrol in Limousin. A seemingly minor skirmish, but its impact would reverberate across kingdoms and centuries. Richard, despite his many romanticized tales, left no legitimate heir. And in this power vacuum, the stage was set for a dramatic contest of succession. On one side, we have John, Richard's younger brother. History knows him as John Lackland, and his reputation, as we'll soon see, is well earned. John laid claim to the throne as the eldest surviving male descendant, a reasonable claim, one might think. But then there was Arthur of Brittany. Arthur was Richard's nephew, the son of Richard's older brother, Geoffrey, who had tragically died years earlier. According to the principle of representation, the idea that a deceased heir's rights passed to their children, Arthur had a strong case. Now, this is where things get interesting and deeply intertwined with the fate of Normandy. England and Normandy, with their preference for the uncle over the nephew in matters of succession, largely sided with John. He was swiftly crowned Duke of Normandy in Rouen on April 25, 1199, and a month later, King of England in London. But the barons of Touraine, Anjou, and Maine, ever keen to assert their own independence, threw their support behind young Arthur. And who was there, ever watchful, ever opportunistic to fan these flames of discord? None other than Philip Augustus, King of France. Philip, a man of profound strategic acumen, saw this succession dispute as a golden opportunity, a chance to finally dismantle the sprawling Angevin empire that had so long overshadowed his own kingdom. He immediately seized Évreux and Conches, pushing into Anjou under the guise of supporting Arthur's rights. Arthur, in turn, had been placed under Philip's protection by his mother, a classic move in the grand chess game of medieval politics. With this troubled succession as his leverage, Philip's royal troops began to penetrate towns that were openly hostile to John. By August of 1199, A peace conference was convened in Normandy, a tense gathering of two kings with vastly different agendas. Philip, ever the suzerain, was quick to remind John of his feudal obligations. He pointed out John's negligence, his failure to secure proper investiture for the disputed succession, and then, with a flourish, claimed Anjou and Maine for Arthur Touraine, having been shrewdly recovered by John's mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, a force to be reckoned with in her own right. For himself, Philip demanded the Norman Vexin. John predictably refused. Negotiations broke down, the air thick with unspoken threats. But the winds of fortune are fickle. Shortly after this, William des Roches, the powerful seneschal of Anjou, surprisingly defected to John Lackland. He managed to broker a fragile reconciliation between Arthur and John, much to Philip's annoyance. Philip, now temporarily outmaneuvered, abandoned Arthur's cause. Arthur, sensing danger, fled from his uncle's grasp, seeking refuge in Angers. This diplomatic maneuver led to the Treaty of Le Goulet, signed between Philip and John. In a move that must have rankled, Philip recognized John as Richard's legitimate successor and, crucially, as his vassal for all his continental fiefs. Arthur, relegated to a subordinate role, became John's vassal for Brittany. Philip, however, didn't walk away empty-handed. His conquest of the county of Evreux and the Norman Vexin was confirmed. In a further attempt to bind the two kingdoms, Blanche of Castile, John's niece, was betrothed to Philip's son, Louis. John, in a desperate bid for legitimacy, even paid a hefty sum of 20,000 marks for the recognition of his fiefs, especially in Brittany. It seemed for a moment that Philip had abandoned his grand designs on Normandy. But the story of John Lackland, as history remembers it, is a tapestry woven with impulsive decisions and disastrous personal choices. The Lusignan family, a powerful house in Poitou, now entered the scene. They were embroiled in a dispute over the county of La Marche, which John had promised to Hugh Roman IX de Lusignan. The deal was sealed with a marriage. Hugh's son and heir was to marry Isabella of Angoulême, the only daughter of Count Aymer of Angoulême. A clever political match designed to bring peace to the region. Then, in July 1200, during a trip to Aquitaine, John Lackland, ever the rogue, encountered Isabella. He was instantly captivated. Already separated from his own wife, he, with breathtaking arrogance and disregard for diplomatic niceties, kidnapped Isabella and married her in August. This act ignited the fury of the Lusignans, who saw their hopes for the lands of Angoulême cruelly snatched away. John, by this audacious move, positioned himself to inherit Angoulême. At Easter in 1201, John thwarted a plot against him, seizing La Marche and attempting to confiscate the lands of the Count of Eu who was implicated. Philip Augustus, ever alert to any weakness in his adversary, watched from the sidelines. He wasn't quite ready for a full-scale invasion, but the idea of conquering Normandy, a dream he had long nurtured, began to stir once more. The Lusignans, deeply aggrieved by John's actions, appealed to their lord. But their lord was John Lackland, the very man who had wronged them. Unsurprisingly, John refused to bring the case before the feudal court of Poitiers. This blatant denial of justice provided the Lusignans with their trump card. They appealed to John's suzerain for his continental lands, King Philip Augustus of France. Philip, sensing the ripe opportunity he had been waiting for, wholeheartedly supported the Lusignans' cause. He summoned John to appear in Paris a fortnight after Easter to answer for his egregious denial of justice. The stage was set for a confrontation. On April 28, 1202, John Lackland, with his customary disdain for authority, failed to appear. He had defied the orders of his suzerain, the King of France, and in a legal maneuver rarely invoked, but entirely within the bounds of feudal law, the royal court declared all of John's continental lands, including the vast and wealthy Duchy of Normandy, confiscated. The decree was issued, the die was cast. The integration of Normandy into the royal domain of France, a process that had simmered for centuries, was now officially on. To enforce this momentous sentence, Philip Augustus wasted no time. In June 1202, he resumed the war. He launched his offensive from the northeast, swiftly taking control of key strongholds, Drincourt, Mortemer, and Lyons. He then laid siege to Gournay, capturing it through a clever ruse, breaking a dam on the Epte River which swept away the town's defenses. By late July, Philip Augustus was laying siege to Arques. At the same time, he made a strategic alliance with young Arthur of Brittany, promising him the hand of his daughter Mary and investiture as count in the counties of Brittany, Poitou, Anjou, Maine, and Touraine. He even knighted the young man. On Philip's orders, Arthur immediately set off to open a second front in Poitou, tasked with conquering his future lands. Despite the support of rebellious Poitevin lords, including the vengeful Lusignans, Arthur's campaign faltered. In a stroke of luck for John, Arthur was captured during the siege of Mirebeau. Arthur, along with other high-profile captives, was thrown into the dungeons of Falaise. News of his allies' capture reached Philip, forcing him to raise the siege of Arques. However, the tide of war had undeniably turned in Philip's favor. Towards the end of 1202, he secured the support of the powerful seneschal of Poitou, William des Roches, who was deeply hostile to John's treatment of Arthur. William brought with him not only his own vassals, the Viscount of Thouars, and the majority of the lords of Poitou, but also the lords of Anjou and Touraine. Their allegiance to the French crown effectively split John's remaining continental lands into two disconnected geographical units, leaving Aquitaine isolated. Breton and even Norman lords, disillusioned with John, began to join the French cause. In January 1203, Robert I, the Count of Alençon, a key Norman lord, defected to Philip, swearing homage for his lands. This betrayal opened up Upper Normandy to the French. By April 1203, military operations intensified in Normandy. French soldiers, bolstered by Norman lords in revolt against their duke, began to encircle the duchy. John, increasingly isolated, found himself entrenched in Pont de l'Arche, virtually under siege within his own domain. The beginning of May brought further setbacks for John. Two important Norman lords, Hugues de Gournay and Pierre de Moulins, switched their allegiance to the French king, surrendering their fortresses. Philip now controlled the strategically vital Ryle Valley. He then swiftly seized Beaumont-le-Roger, Conches, and other smaller towns. La Vaudreuil, a stronghold prepared for a long siege, inexplicably surrendered without a fight in June. In August, Philip took Raidpont, then the formidable Château-Gaillard fortresses that guarded the approaches to Rouen, the very heart of Normandy. Rouen was now caught in a pincer movement. John, desperate, attempted a diversion, attacking Brittany after several unsuccessful raids on Alençon. In a mere 5 days he ravaged Dol and Fougères before abruptly returning to Normandy. But his efforts were futile. He was increasingly isolated, his reputation in tatters, and French propaganda, cleverly amplified, spread rumors that he had murdered Arthur. Arthur, in fact, had died in April 1203, under circumstances that remain murky to this day, though many contemporaries suspected John's hand. Overwhelmed and seeing no other option, John set sail from Barfleur for England in December 1203, ostensibly to raise an army. But many saw it as a retreat, a surrender. In mid-February 1204, Philip Augustus arrived at the formidable fortress of Château-Gaillard, which his troops had been besieging for several months. This stronghold, built by Richard the Lionheart just 8 years earlier, was intended to be an impregnable defense against the French, a symbol of Norman resistance. Philip knew it had to fall quickly. After a long and arduous siege, complicated by its double enclosure, Château-Gaillard finally fell on March 6, 1204. Its capture sent shockwaves through John's remaining supporters in Normandy, effectively opening the road to Rouen, the capital of the duchy. The final campaign for the conquest of Normandy began in earnest on May 2, 1204. In a matter of days, Philip's forces swept through the land, conquering Pont de l'Arche, Roche-sur-Ivel, Lenouberg, Moulineau, and Montfort-sur-Aille. He bypassed Rouen, Arques, and Verneuil for the moment, focusing on consolidating his gains. On May 7, Argenton was handed over by its defender, the Flemish Roger de Gouy. Falaise, a major stronghold, fell after a swift 7-day siege, and Caen, another important city, capitulated with virtually no resistance. William Crassus, the seneschal of Normandy, sought refuge behind the walls of Rouen, the last bastion of Anglo-Norman power. Philip Augustus pursued him, laying siege to Rouen towards the end of May. Simultaneously, the Bretons, thirsting for revenge for Arthur's death, launched an attack on the Avranchin region to the west. Taking advantage of the favorable tide, they captured Mont Saint-Michel by fire, a dramatic symbolic act. They then joined forces with the French armies at Caen, before conquering the rest of Avranchin and then the Cotentin Peninsula. Normandy was being systematically dismantled. Rouen, surrounded by French forces, was prepared for a long siege. The city had ample provisions, enough to last for an extended period, and the last holdouts against the French occupation had taken refuge behind its formidable walls and triple moats. It was commanded by Peter de Préaux, assisted by the elite of the local barons. However, on June 1, 1204, a mere 3 weeks after the siege began, the city signed an agreement with the French. This stipulated surrender in the event of failure or absence of rescue attempts within the following 30 days. This treaty also covered Arques and Verneuil, which were invested but not yet taken by royal troops. The fear of losing the city's commercial advantages if it resisted for too long proved too great. The prospect of a protracted siege and the inevitable devastation that followed was simply too costly. On June 24, even before the deadline had expired, the city gates were opened. French troops marched into Rouen without any resistance from its weary populace. Only Dieppe, whose economy was heavily reliant on maritime trade with England, held out against French authority, and only until 1207. Mainland Normandy was now firmly in French hands. The conquest was complete. However, one crucial detail remained: the Channel Islands. These islands, historically part of the Duchy of Normandy, were not conquered. Philip Augustus lacked the necessary ships, and his troops were too unfamiliar with naval warfare to attempt anything against them. The kings of France would subsequently claim all the islands, but they would never truly conquer them, remaining under the control of the English crown to this very day. And so, with the fall of Rouen, a centuries-long chapter closed. The Duchy of Normandy, a proud and powerful entity, was no longer a semi-independent, Anglo-Saxon-aligned realm. It had been absorbed, integrated, and fundamentally transformed. But the story, as always, doesn't end with a conquest. It merely shifts its focus. How would this ancient land and its people, with their distinct customs and allegiances, adapt to becoming a mere province of the mighty Kingdom of France? The whispers of the wind tell us that is a tale for next time. Welcome back, history lovers. We've journeyed through the turbulent birth of Normandy, witnessed its audacious rise to power, and tracked the Anglo-French chess game that led to its eventual dramatic fall under the ill-fated King John Lackland. The year is now 1204, and the dust is settling on a conquered land. Philip Augustus, the King of France, stands victorious, having wrested control of mainland Normandy from the English crown. But conquest, as history often teaches us, is only the first act. The true drama, the real unraveling and rebirth, was just beginning. Tonight, we delve into the intricate, often messy process of integration. How do you fold a once proud, fiercely independent duchy, a land steeped in its own unique customs and loyalties, into the sprawling domain of a foreign king? How do you assimilate a people who, for centuries, had seen their duke as their true sovereign, even when that duke was also the King of England? This is the story of Normandy's transformation, from a distinct entity to a province of France, a tale stretching from the initial shock of conquest in 1204 to the pivotal year of 1315, and the birth of a document that would echo through centuries: the Charte aux Normands. So, find your most comfortable spot, let the gentle whispers of the past wash over you, and prepare to be immersed in the slow, deliberate pulse of change. From the moment Rollo, the Viking chieftain, landed on the shores in 911 and secured the Treaty of St. Clair-sur-Epte, Normandy had been a land apart. Though nominally a vassal of the King of France, its dukes, especially after William the Conqueror's audacious seizure of the English crown in 1066, often behaved more like independent monarchs. They paid only symbolic homage, sent meager military contingents, and rarely graced the French court with their presence. They minted their own coins, levied their own taxes, and built their own fortresses. The Duke of Normandy held sway over a highly centralized, efficient administration, a feudal system designed to strengthen his authority, not dilute it. Viscounts, acting as his direct representatives, controlled the judicial system, often bypassing local lords entirely. This unique structure made the Duke of Normandy a formidable power, often overshadowing his nominal suzerain, the King of France. For centuries, French monarchs grappled with this Anglo-Norman behemoth. Philip I, a young king at the time of the conquest, could do little to prevent William's ascent, But as he matured, he quickly grasped the inherent danger. His strategy was clear: sever the ties that bound Normandy to England. He thwarted Norman expansion into Brittany, reclaimed the French Vexin, a borderland that would become a perpetual flashpoint, and crucially, fueled internal strife within the conqueror's own family. Philip supported Robert Curthose, William's eldest son, in his rebellion against his father for the dukedom, a strategy that briefly succeeded in 1087, splitting the Anglo-Norman Empire. But this victory was short-lived. Robert, eager to join the First Crusade, mortgaged his duchy to his brother, the King of England, thus reuniting the lands. Then, in 1106, Henry I, William's third son, defeated Robert at the Battle of Tinchebray, fully reconstituting the Anglo-Norman Empire. The French kings were back to square one, facing a consolidated power that threatened their very sovereignty. Louis VI, known as the Fighter, inherited this formidable challenge in 1108. His reign was dominated by constant skirmishes and diplomatic maneuvering against Henry I of England. Louis VI supported various claimants to the Norman ducal title, including William Adelin, son of Robert Curthose, and later William Clito, in attempts to destabilize Henry's rule. He launched campaigns into the French Vexin, vying for strategic control of border fortresses like Geyzers. Though he suffered defeats, notably at the Battle of Bremule in 1119, Louis VI also secured important concessions, such as the homage of William Adelin for Normandy, a symbolic but significant acknowledgement of French suzerainty. However, the unexpected death of William Adelin in the White Ship shipwreck in 1120 once again shifted the political landscape, leading to further coalitions and conflicts. Despite opportunities, such as Henry I's death in 1135, which plunged England and Normandy into a war of succession, Louis VI and his successor, Louis Roman VII, often failed to fully capitalize on these moments of weakness. Louis Roman VII, who ascended the French throne in 1137, continued his father's policy, initially recognizing Stephen of Blois's claim to Normandy. But a seismic shift occurred in 1152, when Louis Roman VII annulled his marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine. Within months, Eleanor married the future Henry Roman II of England, a union that created the vast Angevin Empire, stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees. Henry Roman II, already Duke of Normandy and Count of Anjou, Maine, and Touraine, now added the immense Duchy of Aquitaine to his formidable holdings. This sprawling continental domain, far more extensive than the French royal lands, presented an existential threat to the French crown. Louis Roman VII, realizing the gravity of the situation, immediately attacked Normandy, but his efforts were largely in vain. He later sought to contain Angevin power through a series of alliances, often supporting Henry Roman II's rebellious sons against their father, a recurring theme that exploited the dynastic rivalries within the Plantagenet family. This brings us to Philip Roman II, or Philip Augustus, who became king in 1180 at the tender age of 15. Initially, his relations with Henry Roman II were cordial. Henry even came to Philip's aid against a feudal coalition. But Philip Augustus, a shrewd and ambitious monarch, soon understood the long game. He masterfully exploited the persistent rivalries within the Angevin family. He sided with Geoffrey, Duke of Brittany, against Richard the Lionheart, and later, critically, aligned himself with Richard against his own father, Henry Roman II. This cunning strategy bore fruit. In 1189, Richard, along with his younger brother John, turned against their father, forcing Henry Roman II to flee and die a broken man. The Angevin Empire was fractured, though not yet broken. Richard the Lionheart, crowned Duke of Normandy and then King of England, proved to be a formidable adversary. He quickly reclaimed most of the lands Philip Augustus had seized. Though bound by an oath to join the Third Crusade together, their rivalry simmered, erupting into open conflict in the Holy Land itself. Upon his return, Richard was captured by Leopold V of Austria, a turn of events Philip Augustus exploited with ruthless efficiency. He not only prepared an attack on Normandy, but also actively bribed the Holy Roman Emperor to keep Richard imprisoned. John, ever the opportunist, immediately presented himself in Paris, paying homage to Philip for his brother's continental lands. A short-lived alliance between Philip Augustus and John, aimed at dismembering Richard's empire, led to the fall of Gizers and much of the Vexin. But Richard's unexpected release and swift return to Normandy in 1194 turned the tide once more. He forgave John, reclaimed his lands, and for the next few years, the brutal attritional warfare between the two kings continued, marked by sieges, raids, and the construction of impressive fortresses like Shadau-Gaillard. A 5-year truce was signed in November 1198, offering a brief respite. Then, in March 1199, a crossbow bolt ended Richard the Lionheart's storied life during the siege of Shadau de Challis-Chabrol. His death, without direct heirs, plunged the Anglo-Norman realm into a succession crisis. John Lackland, Richard's younger brother, claimed the throne as the eldest male descendant. But Arthur of Brittany, Richard's nephew, also had a strong claim, based on the right of representation through his father, Geoffrey. England and Normandy, adhering to Norman custom which favored the uncle, quickly rallied behind John. He was crowned Duke of Normandy in Rouen and King of England a month later. Yet, the powerful barons of Touraine, Anjou, and Maine threw their support behind Arthur, providing Philip Augustus with the perfect pretext to intervene. Philip Augustus, ever the master of political opportunism, seized the moment. He not only supported Arthur's claims but also simultaneously captured Évreux and Conches, pushing deep into Anjou. In August 1199, during a peace conference in Normandy, Philip brazenly asserted his suzerain rights, demanding Anjou and Maine for Arthur, and the strategically vital Norman Vexin for himself. John, unwilling to yield, refused, and negotiations collapsed. The conflict was reignited. John, however, made a series of critical blunders. His ill-considered kidnapping and marriage to Isabella of Angoulême, who was betrothed to a powerful Poitevin lord from the Lusignan family, ignited a furious backlash from his continental vassals. When the Lusignans appealed to their direct lord, John, for justice, he refused to hear their case. This denial of justice allowed them to invoke an ancient feudal right, an appeal to John's suzerain King Philip Augustus of France. Philip Augustus, recognizing this golden opportunity, summoned John to appear before the royal court in Paris to answer for his denial of justice. John, arrogant and dismissive of French authority, failed to appear, and on April 28, 1202, the royal court, acting on feudal law, declared all of John's continental lands, including the entire Duchy of Normandy, confiscated. It was a stunning legal maneuver, rarely applied, but now enforced with the full might of the French crown. The confiscation was a legal declaration. The enforcement required military conquest. In June 1202, Philip Augustus launched his offensive. He swept through northeastern Normandy, capturing Drincourt, Mortemer, and Lyons, then laid siege to Gournay, cleverly breaching its defenses with a broken dam. He promised Arthur of Brittany significant territories in exchange for his loyalty, spurring Arthur to open a second front in Poitou. But Arthur, despite some initial success, was quickly captured by John at the siege of Mirebeau and imprisoned in Falaise. The news of Arthur's capture prompted Philip Augustus to raise the siege of Arques, but his strategic position remained strong. He skillfully cultivated the support of powerful disaffected lords, including William des Roches, seneschal of Poitou, who was outraged by Arthur's treatment. These defections effectively isolated John's remaining Aquitaine lands and further strengthened the French hold on Normandy. By January 1203, the Count of Alençon, Robert I, defected to Philip, opening up Upper Normandy to the French forces. Military operations intensified in April 1203. French forces and rebellious Norman lords quickly encircled Normandy, with John himself entrenched in Pont de l'Arche. Key Norman lords, Hugues de Gournay and Pierre de Moulins, switched their allegiance, surrendering their fortresses and giving the French control of the Rille Valley. Beaumont-le-Roger, Conches, and other towns fell. The heavily fortified Le Vaudreuil, expected to withstand a long siege, surrendered without a fight. In August, Philip captured Raidpont and then, crucially, Château-Gaillard. Château-Gaillard, built by Richard the Lionheart, a masterpiece of medieval military engineering, it was designed to be the impregnable guardian of Rouen and the gateway to Normandy. John, increasingly isolated and facing a propaganda war fueled by rumors of Arthur's murder, which likely occurred in April 1203, although the truth wouldn't be known for years, made a fatal decision. In December 1203, he sailed for England, claiming he would raise an army, but effectively abandoning Normandy to its fate. The siege of Château-Gaillard continued for months, a testament to its formidable defenses. But Philip Augustus, determined to break this symbol of Norman resistance, pressed the attack. After a long and complicated siege, employing ingenious tactics against its double enclosure, the fortress finally fell on March 6, 1204. Its capture sent shockwaves through Normandy, opening the road to Rouen and signaling the inevitable. The final campaign for Normandy began on May 2, 1204. In a matter of days, Pont de l'Arche, Roche-sur-Isle, Le Neubourg, Moulineau, and Montfort-sur-Isle were conquered. Argentan was delivered to Philip on May 7. Falaise fell after a swift 7-day siege, and Caen, once a ducal stronghold, capitulated with virtually no resistance. William Crassus, the seneschal of Normandy, fled to Rouen. Philip Augustus pursued him, laying siege to Rouen itself towards the end of May. Simultaneously, the Bretons, seeking vengeance for Arthur's death, attacked the Avranchin region, capturing Mont Saint-Michel by fire. They then joined the French armies at Caen before conquering the rest of Avranchin and the Cotentin. Rouen, the proud capital, prepared for a long siege. The city had ample provisions, and the last vestiges of anti-French resistance had gathered within its strong walls and triple moats, under the command of Peter de Preaux and other local barons. But the tide had turned irrevocably. On June 1, 1204, the city signed an agreement with the French. Surrender within 30 days if no rescue arrived. The fear of losing vital commercial privileges outweighed the desire for continued resistance. On June 24, even before the deadline, Rouen's gates opened, and French troops marched in unopposed. Only Dieppe, heavily reliant on maritime trade with England, held out until 1207. Mainland Normandy was now fully French. The Channel Islands, though part of the Duchy, remained unconquered, a testament to the French king's lack of naval power and unfamiliarity with maritime warfare. They would remain under English control, a permanent reminder of Normandy's lost ducal past. The conquest was complete, but the true work of assimilation, of transforming a duchy into a province, was just beginning. With the conquest of 1204, Normandy became part of the royal domain of France. But the question lingered. Was this a final victory, or would the English, sooner or later, seek to reclaim their lost territories? Feudal law, after all, allowed for the return of confiscated lands if a vassal repented. But Philip Augustus had no intention of relinquishing his prize. John Lackland, despite his earlier failures, made several attempts to reclaim his continental lands. In 1206, he besieged Thouars in Poitou. Then, in 1213–1214, he joined a massive European coalition against Philip Augustus, including Emperor Otto Roman IV and various counts from Flanders, Lorraine, and Brabant. But this formidable alliance crumbled, suffering decisive defeats. John himself was defeated at La Rochelle by Crown Prince Louis, and the coalition was decisively crushed at the Battle of Bouvines on July 27, 1214. After this catastrophic defeat, John found himself besieged by Prince Louis, who, in 1216, landed in England with the aim of seizing the English crown, offered to him by rebellious English barons. But John's death later that year saved the English throne, as the barons rallied around his young heir, Henry Roman III. When Philip Augustus himself died in 1223, Henry Roman III tried to intimidate the new king of France, Louis Roman VIII, by protesting the conquests and urging Norman nobles and burghers to return to English allegiance. Louis Roman VIII, however, stood firm, declaring that he had inherited these lands and could prove his right. For decades, the struggle continued, albeit with less intensity. Naval battles punctuated the peace, and Henry Roman III made several unsuccessful attempts to reconquer lost territories, landing in Brittany in 1230 and again at Rouen in 1242, only to be defeated at Saints. This was Henry Roman III's last military attempt. Diplomacy now took center stage. Louis Roman IX, a man known for his piety and sense of justice, was open to dialogue, but he never wavered on the question of Normandy. Finally, in 1258, the two kings signed the Treaty of Paris. This landmark agreement saw Henry Roman III formally renounce his claims to his lost continental lands, including Normandy, with the exception of the Channel Islands. In return, He received certain fiefs in the dioceses of Limoges, Cahors, and Périgueux, and his possession of Guyenne was formally recognized. Henry Roman III declared himself a vassal of the King of France for his continental holdings, definitively confirming the French conquest of Normandy. The long, arduous process of territorial integration was complete, at least on paper. Now, the deeper, more complex work of cultural and administrative assimilation truly began. The Norman nobility found themselves in an unenviable position. For over a century, their allegiances had often been divided, holding lands and owing homage to both the Duke of Normandy and the King of England, who were, for much of that time, the same person. Now they were forced to choose. Philip Augustus, pragmatic and decisive, gave them a clear ultimatum: renounce your English lands and pay homage to me, or lose your Norman holdings. The deadline was set, 1 year from April 1205, later extended to Christmas of that year. This was a profoundly difficult choice. For many, their English possessions represented a significant portion of their income and status. While feudal law allowed for homage to 2 kings for different lands, Philip Augustus was having none of it. There were rare exceptions, such as William the Marshal, the renowned Earl of Pembroke, who, through shrewd negotiation and a temporary surrender of his Norman lands to Philip, managed to retain his holdings on both sides of the Channel. But for most, a stark choice was unavoidable. John Lackland, in his rage over the loss of Normandy, further complicated matters. He demanded the presence of his vassals in England, threatening forfeiture of their English lands if they remained in Normandy. As early as 1204, he began seizing the property of nobles who had chosen to stay. Some, like Robert Roman IV Bertrand, lost everything. The choices were often agonizing. While about 50% of the great barons opted for England, the vast majority of the lesser nobility, perhaps 5–10%, or around 200 individuals, chose to remain in Normandy. They kept their most important fiefs, regardless of their personal allegiances. Some tried to game the system, exchanging lands or dividing their estates between sons, creating separate Norman and English branches of their families. However, Philip Augustus largely forbade such maneuvers. Until the reign of St. Louis, a strict rule was enforced. Norman lands would be confiscated upon the death of a lord if his closest heir resided in England, leading to endless legal disputes and complex inheritance battles. The clergy, a powerful political and moral force, presented a different challenge and opportunity for Philip Augustus. For centuries, the Norman Church, possessing some of the most prestigious abbeys in the West, had maintained close ties with England. Its monasteries derived substantial income from English estates. Philip Augustus, recognizing their influence, began actively cultivating the Norman clergy even before the full conquest. Under the Anglo-Norman dukes, episcopal appointments had been largely controlled by the duke, with John Lackland particularly abusing this power, prolonging vacancies to seize the regalian rights. Philip Augustus, however, adopted a different approach. As French forces advanced, he swiftly implemented the same policy as in the rest of France, granting the Church the right to freely elect its bishops and abbots. This was a significant concession, a stark contrast to John's heavy-handed interference. The Norman bishops, initially hesitant and seeking guidance from Pope Innocent III, who, while sympathetic to England, acknowledged Philip's military superiority, soon understood the implicit message. They rallied to the French king, demonstrating their loyalty by participating in the Albigensian Crusade and attending Philip Augustus's funeral. In return, the Norman Church gained not only freedom in elections, but also an end to the interminable vacations between episcopal appointments, which had deprived them of income and stability. Philip Augustus also shrewdly maintained the traditional rights of the Dukes of Normandy over the Church, preventing new tithes, limiting ecclesiastical jurisdiction over wills, and protecting lay fiefs from clerical interference. He even introduced banishment for convicted clerics. Unlike the nobility, Norman clerics were not forced to choose between their possessions in Normandy and England. Philip Augustus, understanding the immense economic value of these cross-channel holdings, wisely chose not to alienate them. Religious communities, from Saint-Étienne-de-Quin to Mont-Saint-Michel, gradually secured agreements with the English crown to maintain their English lands. However, exploiting these revenues became increasingly difficult with fluctuating Anglo-French relations. During periods of tension, travel and trade became arduous. Consequently, throughout the 13th and 14th centuries, Norman religious communities began selling off their English possessions as they became less profitable and more burdensome to manage. The cities of Normandy, for the most part, quickly submitted to the French conqueror. Apart from a few wealthy merchants with strong English connections, the general population had little invested in the Anglo-Norman tie. Philip Augustus, keen to secure urban loyalty, immediately began granting privileges. He confirmed Falaise's status as a commune, richly rewarding its mayor. The privileges of the bourgeois in Keene and Rouen were likewise confirmed. New communes were even created, such as at Les Andelys, Non-Ancourt, and Pont-Audemer. Philip Augustus continued to bestow numerous privileges on Norman communes throughout his reign, fostering an environment of urban prosperity. However, Norman communes had a distinct history. Unlike many French towns, which were often born from popular revolt against a lord, Norman communes were frequently created by the duke's own initiative, often as a means to raise revenue. Consequently, many of the communal charters imposed by the former dukes were confirmed by Philip Augustus in 1204. Some existing communes like Falaise and even some of Philip's new creations eventually faded away. Yet, powerful cities like Rouen, Pont-Audemer, and Dieppe, despite their communal status having been imposed by John Lackland shortly before the Conquest, remained highly active. They were governed by the establishments of Rouen, a system that allowed the king to choose the mayor from a list of 3 names put forward by the city's bourgeois, thus maintaining royal control over urban administration. Louis Roman IX later expanded this system to all communes in the kingdom in 1256. The upper middle classes, who led these communes, readily adapted to the new French power. The same influential families and even individuals often remained at the helm. In Rouen, Jean Luce, a prominent figure before the Conquest, served as mayor 3 times between 1206 and 1218. Other families who had governed under ducal rule continued to hold mayoral positions in the decades following the Conquest. One notable exception was Dieppe. Its citizens, whose commercial interests were deeply intertwined with England, suffered greatly from the French conquest. Incidents flared between Deepwa citizens and French authorities. Philip Augustus initially tolerated some cross-channel trade, even when Deep burghers supplied ships to John Lackland for his 1206 expedition to Poitou. For decades, Norman merchants retained some commercial advantages in England, sometimes even being the only ones authorized to trade during periods of Anglo-French tension. Henry Roman III hoped to exploit these ties to garner support for planned landings in France. However, this ambiguous situation eventually gave way to open rivalry. By the 1230, under Louis Roman IX, English and Norman sailors began to view each other as competitors rather than allies. The Treaty of Paris in 1259 formally ended the special privileges of Norman sailors, who were now treated as foreigners in English ports. By 1293, Norman sailors were actively sinking English ships in the burgeoning Franco-English wars, a testament to their rapid Francization. This shift was likely driven by new commercial opportunities in the thriving Paris region, actively encouraged by Philip Augustus from 1210 onwards, drawing inland Norman towns firmly into the French orbit. Despite the conquest, the Duchy of Normandy, in name and spirit, continued to exist. The King of France referred to it as his Duchy of Normandy, even though he never formally adopted the title of Duke of Normandy himself. The traditional enthronement ceremony unique to Normandy ceased. The King of France automatically assumed ducal authority upon his coronation in Reims. One significant administrative change was the abolition of the Seneschal of Normandy, a powerful figure who, since William the Conqueror, had governed the duchy in the Duke's absence. Over time, French sovereigns began to chip away at Normandy's unity. Philip Augustus initially granted some territories like Mortagne and Domfront to the Count of Boulogne, but without making them truly independent of Normandy. Louis Roman IX, however, began entrusting small counties to his sons without reference to Normandy, carving out new entities like the counties of Perche and Alençon. These counties, upon the death of their holders, often reverted to the crown before being regranted to other members of the royal family. A buffer zone, or Norman March, was also conceived by Philip Augustus, merging Norman and French provostships to create a strategic frontier. Crucially, Philip Augustus largely maintained Norman law after the conquest. This was not merely out of benevolence, it was a pragmatic decision. Firstly, France itself lacked customary unity, with dozens of different local customs. The King of France had no single, overarching custom to impose. Secondly, and perhaps more importantly, Norman custom was, in many aspects, more advantageous to the sovereign than any other custom in France, particularly in feudal and criminal matters. He did make some modifications, notably to the practice of dueling, to bring Normans into line with French customs. Throughout the 13th century, royal ordinances which applied across the kingdom gradually modified Norman custom, but always with the caveat that where Norman custom was deemed superior, it would prevail. In judicial matters, Philip Augustus maintained the exchequer, Normandy's sovereign court, a powerful symbol of its former independence. However, he immediately transformed it. The presidency was now held by royal commissioners, often his closest advisors, men from Paris unfamiliar with Norman custom. This led to a critical change. Complex cases were systematically referred to the king, and in violation of Norman custom, several Norman cases were now brought before the Parliament of Paris. Philip Augustus also deployed royal agents, known as bailiffs, to fill the posts already established by the English kings from 1190 onwards. These bailiffs were high-ranking civil servants, appointed and paid by the king, representing royal authority in administration, justice, and military matters. They oversaw other royal officials like viscounts and sergeants. Initially, until about 1230, these bailliages were fluid, shifting districts named after the bailiff rather than a fixed region. Later, more geographically defined bailliages emerged. Until 1243, all of Normandy's bailiffs were foreigners to the duchy, though many made efforts to integrate, acquiring property and donating to local churches. Eventually, Norman bailiffs were appointed, though they remained a minority. Lower-ranking officials, however, such as viscounts, provosts, and sergeants, were predominantly Norman. Many of the Norman lands confiscated from nobles who had chosen England were retained as crown property, entrusted to royal administrators. Other lands were granted to nobles from the royal domain, mostly minor nobles who thus became agents of French assimilation. The kings of France also actively encouraged marriages between Norman and Ile-de-France nobles, further weaving the two aristocracies together. By the end of the 13th century, after decades of integration, signs of discontent began to emerge in Normandy. Royal power, in its pursuit of centralized authority and increased revenue, started to impinge on the traditional privileges of the Normans, particularly concerning justice and taxation. In judicial matters, the Normans chafed at the fact that their exchequer, the symbol of their legal autonomy, was presided over by outsiders. Moreover, from the late 13th century, the exchequer's sessions became less punctual, sometimes not meeting at all, causing legal cases to drag on interminably. In 1302, Philip the Fair took steps to ensure the exchequer met twice a year and settled permanently in Rouen, addressing some concerns. Yet, the practice of trying Norman cases in Paris, both at first instance and on appeal, despite the supposed sovereignty of the exchequer, remained a major grievance. Financially, Philip the Bold and Philip the Fair aggressively increased the monetary contributions demanded from Normandy, largely to finance wars in Aragon and Flanders. While they used the prerogatives of the former dukes, they introduced a new, more expansive justification for taxation: the defense of the kingdom. For the Normans, these new levies were perceived as contrary to their cherished customs. In 1292, a riot erupted in Rouen, with an angry mob demolishing the receiver's house and besieging royal servants in the castle. It took the mayor's intervention to prevent the demonstration from escalating into full-blown anti-French violence. Under Philip the Fair, anger swelled year after year, exacerbated by the fact that the king's powerful chamberlain and financial controller, Enguerrand de Marigny, hailed from the lower nobility of Normandy itself, making him a perceived traitor in the eyes of many. Other Normans also held important financial positions with the King of France, further fueling resentment. In the final months of Philip the Fair's reign, An unprecedented anti-tax crisis gripped the entire kingdom. It reached a boiling point in 1314, when a new tax, levied to finance a Flemish expedition that ended without a single battle, caused widespread public outrage. How could so much money be raised for such a negligible result? Enguerrand de Marigny bore the brunt of public anger, especially as taxes for Flanders continued even after peace was declared. When Philip the Fair died in 1314, his successor, Louis the Quarrelsome, inherited a volatile situation. To appease his restive subjects, in March 1315, a few months after his coronation, the King of France began granting provincial charters. The very first and arguably the most significant was for Normandy, adopted after intense negotiations with the Norman representatives. This document, known as the Chart aux Normands Asterisk, was unique. Unlike other provincial charters, many of which quickly faded into obscurity, the Normandy Charter endured for centuries. It contained articles that satisfied a broad spectrum of Normans, from burghers to nobles to the poorest peasants, by limiting the king's rights in fiscal, military, and judicial matters. Some of its articles, particularly 3, 4, 17, 21, and 22, effectively functioned as a Norman constitution, making it a document unparalleled in France. Articles 3 and 4 addressed military service, stipulating that vassals owed the king no more than the traditional 40 days provided by feudal custom, and towns had to provide only their agreed contingent of sergeants. Crucially, the king could no longer directly claim service from his rear vassals, a major victory for Norman feudal autonomy. Articles 17 and 21 granted the exchequer the judicial autonomy the Normans had so fiercely demanded, ensuring that the Parliament of Paris no longer served as a court of appeal, and that Normans could not be tried outside the province. Article 22, concerning taxation, guaranteed that the king could not levy more than his normal collections, except in cases of great necessity, recognized by the representatives of the Norman orders. The Chart aux Normands Asterisk remained in force until the French Revolution, a testament to its enduring power and the persistent Norman identity it enshrined. While successive kings of France respected it with varying degrees of enthusiasm, they were compelled to continually reconfirm it. The slow, arduous process of assimilation had, paradoxically, culminated in a document that formally recognized Normandy's distinct legal and administrative character within the French kingdom. And so, the journey of Normandy, from a Viking settlement to a powerful duchy, then a prized possession of the English crown, and finally a fully integrated but uniquely defined province of France, reaches a significant milestone. The unraveling of the Anglo-Norman identity and the rebirth of a distinct Norman soul within the French context is a story of resistance, adaptation, and the enduring power of local custom in the face of centralized authority. For over a century, the Normans had wrestled with their destiny, and in the Chart aux Normands Asterisk, they carved out a place for themselves that would last until the very foundations of the French monarchy crumbled. This is vibing history. Good night. And so, our long journey through the integration of Normandy comes to its natural conclusion for tonight. From its fierce independence to its eventual assimilation, Normandy's story is a profound testament to the shifting tides of power and the enduring legacy of human ambition. It reminds us that history is not just a collection of dates, but a living narrative, rich with lessons and unexpected turns. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into the past. If this historical voyage has served its purpose, whether for focused work, restful sleep, or simply the pure joy of discovery, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. What did you find most surprising, or what other hidden chapters of history would you like us to explore next? Until our next gathering around the historical campfire, keep seeking, keep learning, and keep vibing with history. Do consider liking, sharing, and subscribing for more journeys through the ancient world.